Welcome to The Making of Madrid, a podcast about life in Madrid, covering history, culture, food, and much more. The show is presented by me, Listy Hughes. I'm a tour guide and freelance writer, and you may have seen my work in Lonely Planet or the Financial Times. Now, this is a very special episode all about literary Madrid. And I think the timing's great because autumn is the perfect time to crack a book open and get reading, snuggle up on the sofa. And if you're planning a trip, what better way to get to know the city than through its literature? The episode is going to be in 3 parts. So the very first part is I'll be doing a little bit of a deep dive into the history of Madrid's literary district. The second part, I'll give you a few recommendations for books set in Madrid. And to close things out, I've got an interview with James Hartley. He's the editor of the recently launched Madrid Review. So it's a good one for all you aspiring writers out there. And the good news is you don't need to live in the city to get published. But we'll have more on that later. And I'd like to kick things off with the history of Madrid's literary district, or Barrio de las Letras, or Huertas. So we'll go into the name in a second, but I should mention that this is a subject really close to my heart, as this spring my guide to Madrid's literary district came out. Not only that, but I just launched a voice map tour of Madrid's literary district. And in it, you get to wander around the streets of Huertas and find out all about the places that have a historical connection to Madrid's literary life. So let's begin with Huertas. What is in the name? Because this area, Madrid's literary district, has 2 names. It's called Huertas, and it's also called Barrio de las Letras. So the more official name, Huertas, means kitchen gardens, but it's began to become known as Barrio de las Letras because of its literary history. So Barrio de las Letras simply means neighborhood of letters. The reason why it was initially called Huertas is a reference to the fact that it was a fairly rural area. Now, that seems absolutely inconceivable now, because if you visit Barrio de las Letras, it's absolutely chock-a-block from morning till night. In fact, if you're going to do my audio tour, I really recommend you do it in the morning around 10 a.m. before things get really, really crazy. It's a lovely area, nonetheless. But it's really smack bang in the center of the city. When Philip II made Madrid Spain's capital, however, in 1561, Madrid was a town, not a city. And it was a walled town, and this area was actually outside the city walls. Philip expanded the city walls fairly quickly, but it was still fairly green. And, people might be growing vegetables or whatever around here. If you go into Lope de Vega's garden, you can see oranges hanging from the trees, which I suppose is the last sort of hangover from this time. But it rapidly developed once the Corral del Príncipe was founded. Now, the Corral del Príncipe is a theatre that's key to the literary history of this area. So it was built in 1583, and it's where the Teatro Español now stands, on the Plaza Santa Ana. Before this theatre was built, there weren't any other dedicated theatres in the city, but the theatre was incredibly popular and growing ever more popular day by day. Corral is a kind of square-shaped building, usually residential in the day. in which there are balconies overlooking a square sort of patio. And in the patio, there would be stages set up, and people could look down on the action and watch a play going on. I suppose the Plaza Mayor is like the most gigantic corrala you can even think of. And indeed, they did put on plays in the Plaza Mayor. But the Corral del Príncipe was made so that plays could be put on and not inconvenience residents. And Philip II used funds so he could build a hospital. And this meant that the area really, really attracted writers. So one of the names you'll see on the top of the Teatro Español is Lope de Vega. And he's Spain's most famous playwright, a contemporary of Shakespeare, incredibly prolific. And he was really, really successful out the gate in his 20s. He was handsome. He had loads of lovers. He's a fascinating character. So on my tour, you get to go into his house. You can go into his house and visit it anyway, even if you don't take the audio tour. And you can see where he lived. I really recommend you book in for a tour in any case. Visit the website, the Casa Lope de Vega, and they do tours in English and Spanish. And they tell you all about Madrid of his time. Cervantes actually lived just up the road. Cervantes may well have been quite jealous of Lope de Vega because he was 15 years older than Lope and he didn't really have any literary success. He tried his hand at the theatre, but no one really wanted to put on his plays. And his literary success came very late in life when he was pushing 60. That's not to say that he wasn't successful in his life. The Don Quixote was a smash hit when it came out. It just wasn't a theatrical hit. So it's really interesting that Lope de Vega's house was preserved for posterity, but Cervantes' house was bulldozed. So all that remains now is a little plaque to say that it was there. There was one man who tried to save it from the bulldozers, but he tried in vain, and his name was Mesonero Romanos. He was a liberal intellectual historian in the 19th century and one of the founding members of an institution called the Ateneo de Madrid. And he's really, really famous in Madrid because he wrote a little history of the city that's still read to this day and was used as the basis for all those lovely street signs you see in Madrid. So he noted down all the tales that were attached to different parts of the city, and we get names like Calle de la Espada, the Street of the Swords, where there was an old sword fighting school. If you're interested in that, have a look at the blog post I wrote about it. In any case, Mesonero Romanos even physically tried to protect Cervantes' house from being bulldozed. He was that passionate about it. But he was tricked by the owner. And even though he got special dispensation for the king to protect Cervantes' house, the whole structure went down. So that's one of the things that you can see. You can see also the convent where Cervantes' bones now lay. But his house, of course, does not exist. I mentioned before that Romanos was a founding member of the Ateneo de Madrid, and that's another interesting site in Barrio de las Letras. Like any 19th century institution, for all their liberal ideals, it was a big boys club, lots of mustachioed men going around. Another famous founding member was Benito Pérez Galdós, who wrote a classic book of Madrid called Fortunata y Jacinta. Now, Galdós was the equivalent of Dickens, the Spanish equivalent of Dickens, a realist, terribly interested in social equality. So, like Dickens or Zola, a French contemporary, he was outraged by the poverty that he saw around him and really wanted to sort of press for the rights of the working classes, which makes Fortunata and Jacinta a great novel because it really goes into the life in Madrid, not only from the perspective of its upper classes, but from its lower classes too. You can see a quote from Galdós on the Calle de Huertas, which is the central street that runs through Barrio de las Letras. And it's from his novel Misery. And the quote really underlines these values that Galdós had about pushing for equality and highlighting the terrible poverty that existed at its time. I said that Ateneo was a huge boys' club, but it did have a female member at the time. And this member was Galdós's secret lover. Her name is Emilia Pardo Bazán. I absolutely love her. She was a big fan of Zola. She made a great stir with her novels, and really a realist like Galdós. But while Galdós got a quote in bronze letters put on Calle de Huertas to preserve his name in posterity in the early 2000s, Pardo Bazán had to wait until fairly recently to have her name commemorated on the street. Basically because the powers that be decided that when they were celebrating the fact that Huertas has now become Barrio de las Letras, or Spain's literary district, they put all these quotes from writers down Calle de Huertas and failed to put one single female writer on that street, which is just incredible if you think we're talking about the 2000s. I mean, mind-blowing. Women, of course, aren't missing from the history, even though they end up being left out. So that was one of my big bugbears when I was writing this. Or maybe I would think big mission statements, is that I wanted to write the women back in. And so it was great to read writers like Martha Gellhorn. Now, Gellhorn is also known, like Emilia Pardo Bazán, of being the lover of Hemingway. So Bazán was a lover of Galdós, and Gellhorn was the lover of Hemingway. But I think I rate the writing of both women above either of these two writers. Gellhorn visited Madrid like Hemingway during the Civil War. She was terribly brave. She was an unknown quantity, a lot younger than Hemingway. And she wrote about life in the city during the Siege of Madrid, which is a topic I go into quite a bit in the audio tool. So if you're interested in that subject, it's a good one to take. Hemingway, too, of course, is interesting about the Siege of Madrid. And if you are interested in the period, his biggest book about that time is For Whom the Bell Tolls, although several writers have criticized him for sort of milking his time in the city for that novel, but actually skimping a little bit on the straight reporting. So if you really want to read about the Siege of Madrid, read Arturo Barella, who is a native of Madrid. I'll talk about him in a bit. Or read Martha Gellhorn. Some of her writing on Madrid is part of the collection of The Face of War, and it's very, very moving. It's a subject that I find really difficult to read about, by the way, because it's so terrible and so close to recent living memory that I find I choke up a little bit. Anyway, if this has whetted your appetite, please do go and buy either my voice map audio tour or drop into the Secret Kingdoms bookshop and get my history of Madrid's literary district. Let's move on now and talk about my fiction recommendations for this winter. And my very first one is a really big, thick, chunky one that you can get into, get swept away into the ambience of 19th century Madrid. And that I'm talking, of course, about Benito Pérez Galdos's Fortunata and Jacinta, which is the great classic book on Madrid. I mentioned before that Galdós was a realist. He visited the corralas, which were really, we mentioned before that the corralas were where the theatres were born. They're these kind of square buildings with a patio in the center. They're also where Madrid's working classes lived. So it's a sort of art form that bubbled up from beneath. There's a lovely description of a corrala in Fortunata and Jacinta. Also a great description of a rather poverty-stricken flat upstairs on the uppermost floor of the Plaza Mayor, which it's inconceivable now that somebody in poverty would live in that area. Of course, these flats go for thousands of euros now. I mean, hundreds of thousands of euros, of course. But in that time, you still had working class people living in the top floors because they were hard to access and they were uncomfortable in summer. This is a very common thing in Northern Europe, I think, in city life. So he really wrote about life in the city slums, and the idea was to shock the wealthy classes into taking action. The book was published in 1887, and the plot follows the travails of a privileged young man who has an affair with a young working class woman, and he abandons her when she becomes pregnant. And then he's quickly married off to his cousin, Fortunata. So those two women are the women in the title. And I won't include any spoilers, but I will say that the plot begins to heat up when Fortunata fails to conceive. The other interesting thing I ought to mention before moving on as well is that the novel opens with a tertulia. And tertulia is a really interesting facet of Madrid's literary life. The word doesn't really have an English equivalent, but if you think about French salons, like literary salons, that is really what a tertulia was. A tertulia was a place where you had an intellectual debate, perhaps in a shop or somewhere like Ateneo, a bit posher, or in a bar. And intellectuals would gather to discuss the topics of the day, and often they would be literary. So please do take a look at Fortunata and Jacinta because it's a fascinating book. The next book I want to give a little shout out to, although it's not fiction, is Arturo Barrea's The Forging of a Rebel. This is a trilogy. I recommend you read the first and the third of this trilogy because the second one is about his time in the army and it's not actually set in Madrid. Barrea was born and bred in Madrid. Unfortunately, he lived in exile after the Civil War because he was a socialist. He was born into a very poor family, but he was bright and he got a very good education through the church, but he always had mixed feelings about it. So I talk about Barrea a lot. I'm sure I've mentioned him several times in my blog. If you really want to get a picture of what pre-war, pre-Civil War Spain was like, he's fantastic. His childhood memories are great. And also, if you want to get a picture of the chaotic and tragic situation of Spain during the Civil War, read the third part. because that's when he was in his 30s and he lived in Madrid. Hemingway fans might also find a little bit of interest there because he does mention Hemingway. He worked as a censor in the Telefonica building where Hemingway would file his copy. So the two of them sort of bumped heads. But yeah, their relationship is interesting, I would say. My next recommendation is C.J. Sampson's Winter in Madrid. So this book is set in Madrid just after the end of the Civil War, and it details the dire state of the war-torn city. And it's like anything about the Civil War. I mean, I find this absolutely gut-wrenching stuff. Madrid was full of people who had just witnessed this shocking defeat. The vanquished underclass were forced to be silent. The Franco's regime was incredibly repressive. And into this scene comes Harry Brett, who's a British spy who has been asked to get information out of an old school friend named Sandy, who is collaborating with Franco's regime. There's another subplot about getting out a foreign fighter who was fighting in the brigades. He's shunted off to a prison in Cuenca, and it's a really good read. I would say if you find the Civil War a difficult topic, then maybe skirt around it because, like anything about the Civil War, it's pretty heavy. But yeah, I recommend this one. My third recommendation for a winter read is a lot brighter. This is a book by an American poet and novelist, Ben Lerner. I think Ben Lerner is a genius. He's a really fantastic writer. The book is funny and intelligent. Sorry, I should say the title. It's called Leaving the Atopcha Station. It's funny and it's intelligent, and it very sharply dissects the experience of a young American poet who comes to Madrid and is sort of floating around a little bit aimless, but the whole thing is drenched in this really biting cynicism and is incredibly clever. He's mentioned himself that he was inspired by Cervantes because he feels that Don Quixote is the indictment of an empire that's beginning to sort of rot from the inside. And he feels leaving the Astoria station is an indictment of American culture as an imperial power that is also beginning to lose its clout. It's extremely well written, as I mentioned before. It goes into what it means to be an American abroad as much as it goes into life in the city itself. But I think it's a fairly accurate portrait of the experience of coming to Madrid as a student and trying to immerse yourself while also sort of holding on to your identity. Anyway, I love this book, so please do give that a read. Next up, I've got a real treat for you because I'm talking to the editor of the Madrid Review. James Hartley is a writer in his own right, and he started the Madrid Review fairly recently, and they've only just had their second issue out, so it's really exciting, and it's a beautiful publication, so do go and check it out. Hello, James. How are you doing?
Hi, Felicity. How are you? I'm good, thanks.
Thanks for coming on the podcast. How did the idea for the project come about?
I noticed there was all these lit mags online, and I thought it was the one in Madrid, and it wasn't. And I love all the old like the old Paris Review stories, you know, the James Joyce and Shakespeare and Company in Paris and Hemingway stories and the mythology bit, you know, that sort of like cool writery thing. I like that. So I wanted to do like a bit of a homage to that, like And I thought the Madrid Review, I was playing with the ideas, and I thought that sounds good. Sounds like it could stand on its own.
And writers don't necessarily have to be from Madrid, but do they have to have a connection to Madrid or?
No, no. To be honest, when I started, I just said anything, anybody. My only thing, which I'm realizing more and more, is that it's quite subjective to my. Obviously, it's my. I'm not going to publish anything that I don't understand. That's one.
Hmm.
If I can't understand it, me personally, uh, thank you, but not for me. I don't like that when I read. I read a lot, but I don't particularly like. I don't mind deciphering, but I don't like not understanding. And then I tend to, of course, the thing is, we haven't had that many submissions. I'm not talking like, oh, I had to sift through millions. So if something comes out, like for example, Steve Denahan, he in the first issue, he'd been on holiday and he's, I've got some poems. I was on holiday in Mallorca, I think it was. Uh, and I like them, nice, lovely poems. And I thought, well, yeah, I like that.
Mhm.
And then, okay, that was connected with Spain, but there's been people trying to think of people who've written, yeah, from all over the world. Yes, I tend, if it's about Madrid or Spain, so far, I've tended to pick a few, not all of them.
You've managed to recruit some really big names. I was impressed
Mhm.
to see Paul Preston and Colin Toybin. I never know how to pronounce his name.
Yeah, me neither. Toybin, I guess it's Toybin.
And how did you swing that?
Paul Preston, for example, fascinates me. I wrote to him and I got lucky because I like Everton and he likes Everton. And I
Yeah.
think I got him on a good day because he
Mm.
kind of wrote back and said, oh, well, oh, you're an Evertonian. Well, and I was like, well, could you tell me about? I think he also had his book out. I mean, I'm not right contacting them randomly. He had his
Mhm.
Architects of Terror book. And then he kind of started telling me about, well, when I was young in Madrid, I said, oh, can we, if you just write that, I'll edit it and put it in. That'd be brilliant. No, I mean, when he came to Madrid. And so that was that.
Yeah,
Paul
I was
Toybin
really
had a book out.
interested in reading that, especially because I thought he was part of the old guard, the Oxbridge kind of elite.
Yeah,
And then it turns out that I think probably, of course, the Civil War often really attracts working class people who sort of want to puzzle out like what went wrong with the kind of socialism at the start of, well, in the 20s and 30s. But fascinating. I really want to do a piece about fascist Madrid, and that little personal account of his in the interview would be
it's
great.
fascinating, isn't it? Because we can see it also echoes of it, of course, in as soon as you, I mean, it's this is all within living memory still.
Mm.
No, I mean, it's not something that happened. It's referenced in the news and
Mhm.
online all the time. I mean, it's there all the time. It's under the politics now, and I think, yeah, it's fascinating. It's just a fascinating thing. And okay, it's not a political magazine for me. It's but it's fascinating somebody to tell me what was it like then, and again that aspect of Madrid that we know, Gran Via that we know, and
Mm.
what was it like when you were there in '76? Tell us about it, and why did you decide to study it? And I love those stories. I love them. I love them.
Yeah, I think one of the things I hadn't heard too much about was the amount of people walking around with lost limbs. And it really reminds me of when I visited Cambodia, because of course for them, like that is much more recent history. And the other thing about the repression, the police just coming and scooping up people, and
Yeah,
interrogating them. I think that's something that we forget is very close in living memory. And my parents-in-law remember that and remember being terrified of the police. So yeah,
it's
it's
still
great.
there. And I think anybody that you ask has a story, and within families too. Um, Not horror stories. They're horror stories, but really real dilemmas, if you want. And it's not a simple thing to unpick. It's more. I don't know. For me, it's an endless. Sometimes I'm revolted by the whole thing because it was vicious. The whole. And other times I'm fascinated by the. There's aspects of it that looked at some of the posters, the artwork is is fascinating. Some of the social changes that came about, and then the idea that I mean, the little things like the bullet holes in the Telefonica building. I don't know if it's called Telefonica building anymore, and all those stories, and the international brigades here in Las Rozas. There's still the bunkers from the Battle of the Fog, the Battle of the Coruña Road, and there's groups that go around them and talk. I don't know. It's there. It's all the time, and it's going to be there for. I mean, it was recent in historical terms, no? And
Mhm. And how
so
about Kong Toybin? How did you get him on board?
he was in Barcelona in the 70s, and was sort of exploring his sexuality, and
Mhm.
had uh, the sort of that there was that atmosphere then of still like repression, and so he was there and he found it sort of exciting, I think. I mean, I don't know if he'd say that. I'm not don't want to put words in his mouth, but his descriptions of that time in Barcelona and what he because he drew lots of parallels between his life and Baldwin's life. So I think he's written about Barcelona too in his novels, and so I think he was happy also with the Madrid, not Madrid connection, Spanish connection.
Mm.
So I think again, lucky.
So Barcelona was like Paris for Baldwin. So I mean, for him,
That exactly.
it's his Giovanni's room.
That's it. Yeah, it was. I think it was. And he wrote. I can't remember the name of the book he wrote about it,
Mhm.
but he talks about that in the magazine, and he was. I think it just made a big impact on him. Like Spain also. I've noticed now because I'm starting to notice more similarities between. It makes a big impact on people, Spain, and we live so close together, and it's such a different culture,
Mm.
and it has real attraction, and it's just really exciting.
All right. So tell me, what has the response been so far to the literary review?
Again, really good. It's only 2 issues. This is the second, so it's growing.
Mhm.
I was lucky to get John Boyne and Paul Preston, and you probably found this that people who are at the top, if you want, are generally, well, they might be hard to get to and everything, but I mean, it's understandable. But they're genuinely nice people.
Where would you like to take the project in the future then?
Like I said, I want to formalize it and make it a bit more. I want to pay the writers, pay people who contribute poetry. It's proud.
To wrap things up, I wanted to ask you, what's your favorite hidden corner of Madrid and why?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this. I thought maybe La Coquette Blues Bar, which it's just off the Calle Arenal. I can't remember. Calle de las Islas, maybe. Well, no, everybody, if you're listening, you're walking down to Opera from Sol, and it's one of the little streets. It's a blues bar, and they have live music Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday nights. I
Mm.
haven't been for years, but I sent some friends there who were staying in Madrid, and it's brilliant. It was great. It's a cellar, a brick cellar. And I used to go there. Well, that was my second home. Used to go there, listen to blues music, and there was a house band called Juan Whiskey, Juan Coke, and Juan Beer.
Mhm.
And no, just I love it. It's a little corner. It's still going. It's survived, and it's a lovely little place. And they have the live music. I think the weekends is more just they put records on and you go down there for a drink. But Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday nights, there's 3, 9 o'clock, 11 o'clock, and 12 or 1 with a live band and in that brick thing. Even if you don't like the music, it's lovely. Yeah, so that's probably my favorite.
Yeah, I love those underground brick cellars. The last question is, what is your favorite word in Spanish and why?
Yeah, I thought so.
Or
I thought it's a
phrase?
word or phrase. Ooh. Well, there's a couple, but most are vulgar. So I'm going to go for a clean one. Okay, which is mimitos,
Mhm.
which is like mimos, no, but because my wife says it and she used to say, mimitos, mimitos, like give me a hug or something like that. I understood. And then one day I was in a business English class, and I never knew what it meant, and I was saying, blah blah blah, and then they were saying, what does it mean hug? Or we were talking about that expression, and I said, oh, it's like mimitos, and they all just they were on the floor laughing at me, saying, "Oh, mimitos! Who says mimitos to you?" Oh. So it still makes me laugh, that word, and I've learned not to use it in,
Yes, because
sort of
it's kind of
Russian
cute if you say mimitos, but
in
it comes from
private.
mimos, which is like caresses, right? Because
I
my
just used
husband
it
always
wrong.
says that the cats are pidiendo mimos, like they're asking
Exactly.
to be stroked.
Mimo. But mimos would be the male. But because my wife is like, mimitos, mimitos, little, give me a little. So I think using that word in a business class wasn't a. Anyway, no, I love Spanish. I should speak more Spanish.
All right, well, that's about it. Thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Felicity. That was lovely.
Okay.